Hello.
Welcome to Bookstore One. Thank you so much for being here. Of course, naturally, we're a bookstore, we sell books, but we also do a whole lot of events like you're seeing this afternoon. Author talks, book signings, live radio theater, that sort of thing. And we wouldn't be able to offer a fraction of the programming if it weren't for supporters like you. So thank you so much for being here. So now, let me introduce you to the author of the hour. He is the author of the Billy Boyle World War II Mysteries. The debut, Billy Boyle, was released as a top 5 book of the year by BookSense. A Blind Goddess was longlisted for the Impact Dublin Literary Award. The Rest is Silence was a Barry Award nominee, and The Devouring was a Macavity Award nominee. He's a former librarian who lives on the Gulf Coast of Florida with his wife, Deborah Mandel. So now, and he's the author, of course, of the book that you have to get today, The Phantom Patrol. So if you've not yet picked it up, it's right downstairs. But of course, I'm talking about one of our favorite authors and visitors. It's James R. Benn. So let's give him a big welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we'll be in conversation a bit. I'll ask some questions before passing it off to you guys. So if you have a question, be thinking of it, save it, and we can take them after. And then a book signing. So we're actually having this conversation on the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. So first we'll start. Do you want to talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book?
Well, yes, and I have to congratulate you, Bren, for coming up with the idea of doing this event on December 16th, which totally went over my head. Well, why are we doing it this late? Oh, so this is very auspicious. This is the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. And it's an event that features prominently in this book. And I had been struggling for a while in this series to come up with a way to address it because it's such a huge event. I mean, a major battle, one of the largest battles ever fought by the U.S. Army, and one in which we incurred a huge number of casualties. So this book was really my attempt to bring the reader into the opening days of that battle and through the characters, get a sense of what it was like, because now we call it the Battle of the Bulge. That term was only coined by a correspondent after the battle was over. At the time, these guys didn't know what was going on, and that's how I approached writing this, which we can talk a little more about, but it was to try to give you not a bird's eye view, but a GI view of what it was like to go through that.
Yeah, let's talk about that approach, the lens in which you wrote this.
I'll just mention the cover. So this cover was inspired by an actual photograph. It was against the regulations for soldiers to carry cameras or diaries on the front lines. And there was one GI who was a photographer, and he rigged up a camera that he could snap pictures through a buttonhole in his coat. And I found the picture that he took and you may have seen it in black and white over the years, of a soldier emerging from the woods, very cautiously looking around. And it's a little blurry, a little out of focus, but it just evoked for me that sense of not knowing what was happening. So the cover spiffed that up a bit. It looks a little clearer and nicer for the cover, but that was how that came about. And so the Battle of the Bulge was an offensive that the Germans came up with out of nowhere, caught everybody napping, because before that we had overrun France, captured Paris, and the Germans were hightailing it for the German border. And there were sayings like, out the door in 44, the war was going to be over, we'd all be going home by Christmas. And there was what they later came to call victory fever, that everybody thought the war was over and we'd won. But Germans unexpectedly came up with this offensive, and for many of the soldiers who fought it, including Kurt Vonnegut, who was a young 18-year-old soldier who was captured in his first days on the line, they just didn't know what was happening. This huge attack came out from nowhere, overran them, and they fought their battles only knowing what they could see in front of them. what happens in this book is, see, in each of these novels, Billy Boyle has to have a reason to be there. So he can't just be like Zelig, just appearing anywhere I want him to. So the crime, the fictional crime, based on fact that he's investigating here, is art theft. And he has to trace a witness to the front line, somebody who knows about a painting by Gustav Klimt that was restolen, I guess you could say, by a British officer who shipped it to England to his family. And the witness to this is out on the front line, so Billy has to go seek him out, and then becomes embroiled in the opening salvos of the Battle of the Bulge. And weaving that kind of fictional mystery into the historical event is a way to illuminate the things that really did happen.
What kind of archival or even first-hand accounts, interviews, what most deeply influenced this book?
I had wanted to write about the art thefts for a long time. So you may have seen the movie or read the book, The Monuments Men. It's pretty familiar. And several years ago, I had wanted to write about that. And then the movie came out with Matt Damon and all those people, and the book came out, and I thought it was just a little overdone. But I had been doing a lot of research into the Monuments and Fine Arts Commission, which is the real name of the Monuments Men. And I found that after we invaded, and after D-Day, and when the Germans cleared out of Paris, they had trouble taking all their loot with them. They had looted so much that they literally couldn't pack it on trains enough to get it back to Germany. And a lot of artwork was left in deserted headquarters, or in rail cars on rail sidings, or abandoned vehicles as they ran out of gas going back to Germany. So this artwork, not some of the major pieces, but a lot of valuable artwork was scattered all across France. And the Monuments Men gathered them up and put them into what they called collection points. And there they would inventory them. And then they would go back to Paris. And that's when a really fascinating character named Rose Valland comes into the story. Has anybody ever heard of Rose Valland? She's one of the heroes of the underground. Without taking too much time, so Rose Valland came to Paris to be a school teacher in the 1930s. Not many professions were open to women. She had a hard time finding a job, and she ended up volunteering at the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris because she couldn't even get a job. When the Germans invaded, the museum staff skedaddled, got out of town. Rose Valland was left there all alone, and she stayed and ended up working for the Germans. A lot of people didn't like the fact that she was, in their eyes, collaborating, but in reality, Rose knew German, and she didn't let on she understood German. So Jeu de Paume became the central collection point for all the looted art that the Nazis stole. So everything went through her museum. She kept track in secret documents for everything was taken, when they were taken, where they went. And she's a character in the story as well. And with many women of the French resistance, her story was sort of blanked out after the war. She was almost beaten by a mob after the liberation of Paris because they saw her as a collaborator. But some of the resistance people who knew what she was doing saved her. She ended up being, she became a French officer after the war and testified at the Nuremberg war crimes trials about who took what in the art collections. I don't know, I forget what the original question was, but that's where the answer led.
What from, digging through archives, interviews, that sort of thing. Yeah, what most deeply inspired. So I'm wondering, did you come across that after having had the idea to write this book, or which came first?
Yes. The notion about including the Monuments Men led me to Rose Valland and her story. I mean, some of the artists that were part of the Monuments Men group were fascinating, but her story really struck home with me because she was just doing this all on her own. She wasn't part of a group. She could have been killed for what she did, but she persevered. And that was really important to me, to tell her story. And then the other historical characters that I stumbled into, who were part and parcel of this time period, were just absolutely fascinating to write about.
So that there's obviously no shortage of World War II historical fiction, novels. But yours stand apart. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you think sets them apart from others?
That's
They're better.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I try not to mess up in each book is the character of Billy Boyle. I think people like him, and that keeps people coming back to see what will happen to him next. So somehow there's some, in the process of creating a character, there's something about Billy that people cleave to, that they want to know more about him, and see how he reacts to the pressures that are put on him. And then there's the introduction of real historical characters that I think readers like. When I can bring in a real historical character in a way that's true to what they were doing at the time, then I think that adds a lot to the book. And it's exciting for me to find out that intersection. That here's my storyline, and here's where this real person was also part of the same engagement. And that makes it fun to write.
Yeah. What's the feedback been like?
On this book, people have talked a lot about David Niven. Everybody knows David Niven, the actor, right? And he almost ran away with the book. He's a larger-than-life character. He's written 2 autobiographies that were absolutely fascinating. And he was a soldier before the war, then went to Hollywood and became famous, and then went back and fought very actively. But he just has such panache that people have really responded to his inclusion in the book. J.D. Salinger is another real historical character, and that's somebody that I had no idea at all of what his involvement in the war was, and it was an eye-opener to learn.
So if someone, I'm learning things, if someone unfamiliar with, there's so much to know about World War II, obviously, but if someone totally unfamiliar were to pick up the book, what would you hope that they would glean from it?
I would hope that they emerge with an understanding of what it was really like for the soldiers, the men and the women to go through. Reading a lot of World War II literature from the 50s, it comes across to me as a little sanitized, that it was such a traumatic experience that a lot of the writing, and of course a lot of the portrayal in film, really sanitized the experience. And it wasn't until Saving Private Ryan came out that people actually saw what 20 minutes on Omaha Beach was like. So I try to, without being overly gruesome and just a real downer, just try to show through the people that Billy engages with what it was really like on the front lines.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your background before writing books and how that influences the writing that you do now?
I started working in the library field because I like hanging around books. And to tell you the truth, I really never liked going to work. The act of getting up and having to get dressed and go somewhere just always irked me. And it was decades before I realized maybe I could do something myself, and that might be writing. So I've been influenced by the world of books throughout my whole life. My first job was at a library. Never had a job in a bookstore, but the library field just helped me orient myself towards the world of literature and research. And then that finally led me to start something I always had wondered if I could, to see if I could write a book. That was the challenge I put to myself.
And can you ever? Many books later, here we are.
Can't stop.
But why historical fiction, though?
I think it's ways to portray history, because writing in the 1940s, I'm writing about an era that we really don't know much about. It's so different from our experience of today. Even folks who were young in the 1940s didn't really have to come to grips with the realities of life now. And it's just so different. Life expectancy is so different. The range of knowledge we have about other states, other countries, other people is virtually unknown then. People just didn't move very far from home. And it's trying to get into that mindset of what it was like to be alive then, and how people perceive the world, and try to be true to that in the characters. That it's an interesting challenge. And I just don't have much interest in the notion of writing something set in current times with cell phones and all that. It's just, that's just life. So
Yeah, you're living it already.
yeah. That's enough of that.
Right. Have you visited any of the locations in the book?
Yes, we haven't traveled since the COVID stuff, but before that we have gone to England and France and Italy, Sicily. So there's been a lot of hands-on, walking the ground. And some of that is very revelatory because it's not what I expected. In Sicily, there were so many things I didn't expect. That was the third book, and I just remember when we came back, I had about a month before I had to turn the manuscript in, and I just went crazy, just adjusting things and revising, because the people, the terrain, everything was different than what I had expected. It seemed valuable.
Okay, I'm also wondering if you could go back in time and be just a fly on the wall for any historical event in all of history, what would it be?
Well, that's. And
You don't have to
safe.
keep. You don't have to
safe
keep.
doing
Yes,
this, right?
and you wouldn't have to keep living there.
Oh,
during that
go.
time.
That's a key question.
Just to see for yourself.
I think because my mother was in Times Square on VE Day, and you know about the statue here. She was a nurse, and she always claimed the woman being kissed by the sailor was her girlfriend who worked with her. But it turned out that somebody did some research, and it couldn't have been. But I never told her that.
Go fact check your mom.
Because I grew up with that story. It would have been. I think it would have been fun to experience VE Day in Times Square, and then come back here.
Okay. And are there any other? What other moments in history are you looking forward to writing about?
Well, I'm coming to grips with the timeline of this series because next year the 20th book will be out, and that's going to bring us to the turn of the new year into 1945, and it only leaves 4 or 5 months of war left. So I intend to write each one very slowly, just 2 or 3 days. But I'm looking towards what it will be like at the end of the war, and what that situation will be like for Billy and his friends in Europe. So I'm trying to adjust my viewpoint now and start thinking about the post-war world and what opportunities that offers for stories to tell.
What do you think it is about World War II that continues to capture readers and writers alike?
There's such a depth there. There's so many, even though we say we knew who the good guys and the bad guys were, within those divisions, there's the bad good guys and the good bad guys, and there are so many complex characters that I think it provides for sort of a template for us to examine how we view the world today. So I'm beginning to do research on a couple of books from now set in Italy and all the desperate attempts by the Germans to surrender safely and get themselves out of the noose. And it's just fascinating to watch all the machinations that they had and trying to figure out who's going to survive the war. And the things that people who do truly terrible things try to switch their attitude and do some good at the end of the war to save some lives. So that's very contradictory, and that's the kind of grist that I think feeds a writer, that looking at somebody who's doing something at odds with themselves, and what kind of conflict, what kind of emotional turmoil does that bring up, and how does that impact the other characters in the story? So that's where my head is at right now.
Yeah,
So.
that makes sense. I'm wondering too, in your research, it doesn't have to have been for this book, can you tell us a fact or a story that you stumbled upon that surprised you, shocked you?
Well, it actually is from this book, and so J.D. Salinger, we all probably had to read Catcher in the Rye at some point, but I had no idea. I read somewhere that he had been in the Army, and I found out he had been a counterintelligence agent with an infantry division, and then I found out that he went ashore on D-Day and fought all the way into Germany, and I never, ever understood what a lot of his work was about until I read what he did in the war. And then I went back and I read his short stories, and I was like, oh my God, no wonder the guy was a recluse. I mean, he was shell-shocked, combat fatigue, the whole 9 yards. And reading his short stories especially, or even Catcher in the Rye, the title for Catcher in the Rye comes from a point in the book where Holden Caulfield is saying he's describing a dream that he has, and there are all these children in the field of rye, and they're running off a cliff, and he's trying to stop them, and he says, I guess I have to be the catcher in the rye. And those are his friends who were killed in the war. It's just mind-blowing. So it totally alters my view of his writing, and it was the kind of thing where when I read that maybe in high school, I thought it was cool, and I read it later again, I thought, who is this jerk? But now it's like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Which is exciting to have developed such a deep understanding. Yeah. Okay, I have more questions, but I will open it up for all of you. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand. Go ahead.
If I remember correctly, Jim, you were talking about going back before the pandemic to see some of the landscape of where the great battles were fought. I think I remember you saying one time when you were, just before you wrote, and maybe why you wrote your first book, you were in Italy, and you discovered something in a cemetery in Italy. And I thought it was fascinating.
You're close. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is really what got me started in writing, and it was on a hiking trip in Germany. So you're in the neighborhood.
Close.
And we were hiking on a mountain trail, and we found a very small German military cemetery. And in it, there were graves. The only marker in German was to the unknown Russian. And the first thought, why are there Russians in a German cemetery from the war? But also, and it was a very remote location, there were fresh potted geraniums on the Russian graves. So I asked myself the question, why are the Russians here? And who, 40 years later, brought fresh flowers to their graves? And that's what actually got me started writing my very first book, which Billy Boyle was a minor character, and that's a long story. But that was the kind of event where you just try to figure out why something happened and come up with your own answer.
It's a big moment. What other questions?
And did you find out?
Of course.
If you want to read the book now. Yes, that book is titled On Desperate Ground, and it's not a Billy Boyle book anymore. But it was Russian volunteers who served with the Germans either through coercion or of their own free will. And it was one of the last battles in the last days of the war. But the flowers, I had to make that part up myself. I don't know why.
Did you have an opportunity to interview vets from World War II in most of your books, or many of them?
Early on, I had a number of opportunities that were fantastic. And now, because of advancing age declining numbers. It's been a while. It's been years since I've been able to talk to somebody. But what happened was people started saying, my uncle, my grandfather, so-and-so, he's never talked about the war, but he said he'd help you. And you could ask him questions if you wanted. So invariably, it was like pulling teeth. And there were times when guys told me things they had never said since World War II, things they did, things they saw. So that was absolutely invaluable, and it was an honor. And although now, I mean, it's routine to see World War II at age 100. So yeah, not so much anymore.
That's a huge responsibility to have on your part.
Yeah, because a number of things they told me made their way into stories, and I wanted to make it as true as it could be to what they said.
You had a question?
Will the Baron ever find love after Daphne?
Yeah. You know, if you notice, Kaz has had a few, not one night stands, but he's made, I don't know about love, but he's had a good time in a few places. So Kaz is Billy's best friend and comrade who lost the love of his life in the first book. But he did have a thing with an Italian princess in one of the books. And a few books, they'll be going back to Italy, and Princess Nini will return. It's fun to have a stable of characters that have been throughout the book, so then they can come back in and yes.
Will we be comfortable picking up that book for the first time if we haven't heard anything about Billy?
Great question.
before?
Yeah. That's something I work very hard on, because I know that for somebody who's read all the books, they don't want to get an information dump about who's who and what. That would be boring. But what I try to do is introduce the facts early in the book, but not all at once, not in a way that just becomes boring. So many people have said that you can pick up any book, or that they picked up this book and now they've gone back and are starting a whole series. So the feedback I get is good from new readers coming into a book of the series. But then I would say, yeah, if you like that, then read them in order. See how we got here. There's one person just told me they decided to read the whole series backwards because they liked this book, and then they wanted to go back in time and see how Billy. I was like,
Testing that theory.
Yeah.
What other questions? Go ahead.
How has your writing changed or evolved since the first book?
So part of the answer is, in writing a series with a stable of characters, they know how to behave. So when I start a new story, they're kind of ready to go. They know each other. I know how they're going to react to certain things, so it's easier in a way, but then there's the challenge of keeping it fresh. And what I try to do is sharpen my sentences with each book to try to make it the best writing that I can do. Because I know it's 20 books, and sometimes people can say, well, I've had enough of that. So I'm trying to work at making sure that the writing is interesting as well as the story. And I think it's like anything with practice, I've got some standalone books, so I've probably written about 25 books now, so I better have learned something just through practice.
What other questions? Go ahead.
You mentioned that you had gone to Italy and Sicily and it was not what you expected, and there were some surprises there. In what way?
It was Sicily especially. Some of it was just the terrain. Sicily the rocks are very chalky. There's dust everywhere. If you walk into a room in Sicily, no matter how nicely it's clean, there's a thin layer of just fine dust everywhere. There are no boulders, so at one point I remember I had to hide behind a boulder. There's no boulders in Sicily. There's rock outcroppings. Some of that sounds silly, but it was important. but it was also the people. The people were incredibly welcoming. And what I came to understand is that's part of a tradition of welcoming your conquerors and absorbing them so that you can get on with your way of life. But it was notable just how friendly and helpful and in a very real way welcoming. So that was kind of the layering I had to do in that book, is to bring that out as much as possible.
So that brings me to a question. In writing, 20 books in this series, there's bound to be, I'm assuming, some historians or readers have pointed out even the smallest of inaccuracies, like the boulders, for example. Can you talk to us about an example of that and how you handled it?
So early on, I made a couple of mistakes with firearms, and so if you shoot a .45 automatic and you run out of bullets, you can't pull the trigger. You can't go click, click, click. If the slide comes back, you can't operate it. Well, I had to go click, click, click. So a guy wrote to me, very nice, enjoyed the book, you might want to know, blah, blah, blah. If you want to come over, I'll show you how to shoot this thing. I said, okay. Then for some reason, I made the exact same mistake in the next book. I don't know why. And he emailed me again. And he was still nice, but it was like, I got a little nervous. So I switched guns. Billy now has a revolver. He can go click, click, click all at once. But there are some people who are very detail-oriented. I remember there was one email several books ago about a military unit, and somebody wrote me, very nice, but they wanted to know, well, the unit number that you gave them was right, but that they had changed it 6 months before. So there are some nitty-gritty detail people, and they're always very nice. But you really want to pay attention.
Yeah, I think their niceness is a testament to how good your writing is, honestly, because I think sometimes that can not be the case.
Then I'll just say that, parenthetically, then there are people who don't believe that GIs swore. And if you've read my books, they're not laced with profanity, but, every now and then there's a few choice words dropped. And every now I just get, people just don't believe it. Oh, no, our soldiers would never.
My dad was a World War II vet, and he swore a lot.
So, and I hope I didn't offend anybody here.
What other questions? Go ahead.
Have you spent much time going through government archives?
No, there's a lot you can get online, and I try to read nonfiction that's based on primary archives. So I really don't have the time and the wherewithal to pour over archives. I did mention that in book number 10, when Billy goes to the South Pacific, I said in a preface something about the government files can now reveal his connection with John F. Kennedy. And a couple of reviewers actually believed me, and they said, Benn's research into archives has determined that. So I'm careful not to say that.
When you're not working on your own books, who do you like to read, and what kind of books do you like to read?
I do a lot of nonfiction reading for research. To relax, I like nothing better than a nice English mystery with one murder in a village, and that sort of thing. I just finished Ian Rankin's latest Rebus book, which I thought was fantastic. That's a little more gritty, but I like a lot of British mysteries. It's kind of relaxing.
Just a nice relaxing murder. Any other questions?
Yeah.
As these later books become more fun to write, because you've got your characters lined up, it's just more enjoyable to write now than it was on the first book.
I'm sorry, is it?
Is it more
it's
enjoyable to write the books now, the Billy Boyle series
It's
as
becoming
well?
fun to write these books because now you've got this ball rolling.
Yeah. It's always more exciting in the beginning because you have all these ideas of what might happen in the book. And when it gets hard. So right now, for the book for 2 years from now, I'm about a third of the way through, and now it's like, all right, I've got to stop fooling around and writing whatever I want about these characters. I've got to get them moving in the direction of the plot. So that's always challenging, and I don't know that that's gotten any easier or harder. It's the mechanics of the mystery plot that I find the hardest writing to do, because you've really got to structure things in a way that makes sense. So when Billy solves a crime, you go, oh yeah. And that's where I am right now. So we're in Cuba right now. So I decided it was time for Billy and his friends. Cuba was one of our first allies in Central and South America, and there were a lot of Nazi spies there. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on that I never knew about. So I decided it was time to have some fun in the sun.
I wonder with these books how much and how you balance the responsibility to educate and then also to entertain with something like historical fiction.
Well, it's fun to have Billy do the entertaining, because he's a bit of a wise ass, and his comments on things he observes that are meant a way for me to bring out that kind of information, a little bit of teaching. I hope I make it enjoyable through his kind of warped view of things, and do it in a way that is entertaining, because he's constantly surprised by some of the things he sees. So yeah, you have to strike that balance. It's like giving too much or not enough information about the characters for a first-time reader. It's giving enough historical information to be true to the history, but not so much that you're boring somebody.
Okay, so before we get to the book signing, is there anything that you'd like to tell us that we haven't asked?
So next year's book is number 20 in the series. So there's going to be a special guest character returning that people have been asking about, but I won't say who that is. The title is A Bitter Wind, and again, doing research, I literally stumbled across the fact that Jean Conan Doyle, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's daughter, was an RAF intelligence officer during the war. So as soon as I saw that, I thought, she's got to be in the book. So, because Billy is a big Sherlock Holmes fan, so he's a little bit of a fanboy because he's got Sir Arthur's daughter to talk to. So that was a lot of fun to write. So number 20 next year.
Can't wait. And then we'll have another event here.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thanks everybody for being here. Again, if you haven't gotten the book yet, they're right downstairs, and then you'll be hanging out and signing
I'll be
books.
happy to sign books. Thank you all for coming in and asking such interesting questions.
Yeah, thanks guys.